Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Speaking with you is Sohaib Saeed, the translator of the first volume and some other parts of al-Tafsir al-Kabir or Mafatih al-Ghayb by al-Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi. So I have actually never done a presentation where I've read through parts of the Tafsir on video before. So this will be the first time I'm doing that. But before I get to that, I'm actually going to go into some rather technical issues to do with the publication history and the manuscript history of this tafsir in order to illustrate something that I talked about in the introduction. So I'm going to make my way down there. And while I do that, on the right, you can see here one lecture I did give in the past for Medit, which is part of Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. Here in the Dar al-Qurra, I had the great privilege of speaking in a place where great scholars have spoken before. And I shared with some of the researchers and scholars there about some of the challenges of translating this under the title of al-Razi's Great Exegesis and the Future of Tafsir Translation and Authorship. So, as I had mentioned to them and have mentioned on numerous occasions, it is a matter of tremendous regret that this celebrated work has not been published in a critical edition, but instead has been reproduced numerous times with the same typographical errors. So when I was working on volume 1, I did not have access to manuscripts, or I had access to one partial one. But later on, while working on Surahs Yusuf, al-Kahf, and so on, and also coming back to the first volume concerning al-Fatiha, I have now made extensive use of manuscripts, which people within Turkey have put a lot of effort into scanning and distributing online. So that has made it easier for researchers like me in different parts of the world to access those written copies and to go back to the earlier sources to ascertain the accuracy of the text. So Tafsir Razi, despite being an extremely important work, a celebrated work, one which has had a tremendous place in the history of tafsir, it has not received the attention that you would expect it to receive by scholars. And this means that there were considerable errors in the text. A lot of those errors I picked up on as I was reading through, and I did my best to ascertain what should be the correct version of that word. But there were always going to be shortcomings in that, and there are also things which I was not aware of that time, not aware of at that time, but I became aware of later on, especially over the past week when I've been working with my colleague and student Muhammad Abdul Mun'im on researching the manuscripts themselves and doing tahqiq, which is to say a critical edition of the text. Now, the tahqiq of a work like Tafsir Razi is naturally something that would take a great deal of time, require a great deal of expertise that really is beyond me, because this is not my specialist area. I work in tafsir, sure, I work in translation, sure, but I feel like the work of tahqiq and evaluating the correct version of the text should be in the hands of especially some of the Arab scholars, or those at least who are specialized in the field of editing. But I've undertaken some of it in order to figure out what's going on, and that's something I'm going to share with you today. Before I get to that, let me mention a couple of other things. I have also this lecture, which you can find here on the Ibn Ashur Center's channel, about text reuse and the authorship of Tafsir Razi. What you can see here in my personal copy is I've indicated the sections, 1 to 3 sections, which are under doubtful status as being actually the work of al-Imam al-Razi. I call these the sections by Pseudo Razi, and the first one at least can be found through some evidence which I mention in this lecture to be actually the work of Shamsuddin al-Khuwayyi, who was briefly a student of Imam al-Razi. And looking at the manuscripts is actually one of the things that has made that abundantly clear. I'll just show you very briefly here that we have manuscript evidence, as there are some copies from fairly early times, around 1 century after Imam al-Razi, which mark off from Surah al-Ankabut until Surah Yasin as being clearly not the tafsir of Imam al-Razi, but rather the tafsir of al-Khuwayi. And similar may apply to the other inserts which I have mentioned. So, before I continue with that, let's do a little bit about the backstory of the publication of this work. So, the first edition which was produced of this book was this one, which is the Bulaq edition or the Amiriya edition, done in Egypt, and it was published in 1863, around those years. And what you can see here is the first page of the tafsir itself. It's the introduction of the author, and today, inshallah, we're going to be going through this in the corrected version. So straight away, there are certain words here which need to be corrected. But generally, this is the origin of all the editions that we have of Tafsir Razi subsequently. So despite the fact that there are lots of publishers that have issued what they call editions of Tafsir Razi, literally not a single one of them has actually gone back to manuscripts in order to get the text right. Instead, they are all reproductions of this first edition. And of course, we are grateful to those who worked on this and made it possible for Tafsir Razi to see the light of day in print. But it is not a very successful edition in getting the text accurately conveyed, even from the very first line and the very first page and this very first introduction. So at the end of this work, there is a little bit of description about the process. They mentioned that it was given to Jam'un min al-Musahhihin al-A'lam. So they don't tell us exactly how many editors and what their names are. We do have somebody, one of them is mentioned here at the end, called Muhammad Majid Effendi, who is the grandson of Sheikh Muhammad Shihab. So that much is mentioned. And here, it says, قاله نصر الهوريني. So presumably Nasr al-Hourini was one of that team, or was connected with them at least, and he is one of the well-known editors in Bulaq at that time, and has worked on a lot of major works. So it's something very nice here that in this work, which they tell us also was extracted from 9 copies, again without specifying which manuscripts they looked at. They have made their best attempt to give the text accurately, but there are very serious issues, by which I mean words that are mistakenly written, but also sometimes whole sentences that are garbled, phrases that are missed, negating particles that are mistakenly placed or mistakenly removed, and therefore completely flip the meaning of the sentence. So in the work of tahqiq, part of it, of course, is reading carefully and making sure that things are making sense. It's very nice to see these kind of marginal notes which were inserted in this copy. Here, from Nasr al-Hourini, this one we find that he mentions something from Shaykhana al-Bayjuri fi darsihi. So this suggests that the famous Imam al-Bayjuri was teaching Tafsir Razi and made some comments on it. So maybe some of those comments are what we are seeing here in the margins. And some of them are quite useful. This one I'll definitely draw attention to, because we'll come to this in a bit. They printed hayyinun ala Allahi madina wa ghabiruna. Then in the margin they wrote hayyin in some copies is hunna bi dhamm al-ha wa tashdid al-nun fi'lun madin falyunzar or faltunzar al-riwaya. So one should check what is the correct riwayah. I will speak about that inshallah when we come to it. But then after a few pages, you just don't really see many notes. So it wasn't as an extensive hashia as one might have hoped for. And the attention to detail seems to have really slipped off after a couple of pages in what looked like a very nice approach to commenting on the text. So if we leave this 1863 edition, the next one to mention is the Istanbul edition of around 1872. So it's considerably close in time, and 1877 I think is when it was finished. So it's clearly not just a reprint of it. This is a different kind of scan, as you can see. It seems to be, reset, and at the same time they have put in the margin here the tafsir of Abu Saud Effendi to accompany it. But in terms of the actual content, I cannot really detect any change in the words that are presented here on the page. So here, for example, we see Hayyinun ala Allah, Hayyinun ala Allah. And then this marginal notes, these are also seem to be the same as the marginal notes from the Bulaq edition. So we can safely say this is a reproduction of the Bulaq edition. And so are all the ones that come after. So the next one, and this is particularly egregious, really. The Bulaq edition had said in it that they, have found many mistakes in the copies available before then. I can only think that they mean in the manuscript copies, because I'm not aware of any print that precedes the Bulaq one. However, the Bahia edition, which I understand to be from the 1930s, makes some very bold claims about how they had looked at the previous prints, bearing in mind this is a good few decades later, and that they have corrected the problems in those prints. So let's go back to see what they said. So he says, this is before the introduction to the author. They've got a part where they say about this work that they have gone to the previous editions. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find that now. He mentions here that this is a very important work. It's worth printing in al-Matba' al-Bahiyya al-Misriya. So I went to a number of senior scholars to read its usul. Now the usul would mean the manuscripts. وَتَحْقِيقِهَا وَتَرْقِيمِ الْكِتَابِ وَوَضْعِ عُنْوَانَاتٍ. This part we can say is an original contribution by this book. And then they found that there was many problematic expressions and they needed to fix all of this, and they need to clarify it in the margins, and they found many muharrafa words and musahhafa letters in في النسخة المطبوعة بالمطبعة الأميرية. So they're talking about here, the Bulaq edition has got many mistakes. That's true. But frankly, once you start to look through this edition, you find that they have not corrected those mistakes at all. Like I have not really managed to find any corrections at all. And the issues that I'm going to point out to you from the Bulaq edition, or from the edition generally speaking, you would find the exact same mistakes here in the Bahia edition, except that, in fact, I did a Twitter thread on this. Sometimes the Bahia edition has added new mistakes that were not present in the first edition. So this is really, it's problematic. It disturbs me to think, why would you make all these claims about reprinting this work and making it accurate when that work has not been done? And then you see people also repeating these claims and, without checking, without ascertaining whether the claims are accurate, they say, well, okay, the best edition is the Bulaq one. Well, it's not that it's the best, it's the only one. Or they say the Bahia edition is the best because it corrected the mistakes of the Bulaq one. Well, you're just going to believe the introduction and you're not going to read it for yourself. So these are what we could say من التعلقات الفارغة عن المعاني والكلمات الخالية عن تحقيق المعاقد والمباني. But of course, the word is not تعلقات. As you're going to see, the actual word is التصلفات. التصلفات الفارغة عن المعاني. So empty boasts which people make. And as for the niyat of these people, I cannot possibly go into them. Let me just show you a typical modern edition. This is the one from Dar al-Hadith in Cairo. It is the one that I used as the basis for my translation. But some people have misquoted me when I mention this, and they say that Sohaib Saeed says that the best edition is the Dar al-Hadith edition. I certainly do not say that. I do not say that at all. I say very clearly that all editions are the same, and that they are the same in their badness and their awfulness, right? So this copy here, as soon as you start, you see وفقنا لأداء أفضل الطاعات ووفقنا على. When do you say وفق على? There's something strange about that, and you can see that in my corrected edition وأوقفنا على كيفية اكتساب أكمل السعادات. So right from the beginning it has the same mistakes. It has تعلقات instead of تصلفات. And this particular mistake is a significant one, which I'm going to show you in a moment. So if we read through the beginning, I will start to tell you about this a little bit more. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي وفقنا لأداء أفضل الطاعات وأوقفنا. That is to say, he guided us to know about كيفية اكتساب أكمل السعادات. And of course, I can pull up the translation just to help those who would be helped by it. And in fact, a number of the things which we have now corrected in the Arabic copy will affect the translation, so I'll need to go back and fix them. However, to a large extent, I had kind of picked up on what the meaning should be, and then what I needed was simply to, to confirm that with the manuscripts. So a lot of times the translation somehow manages to be correct simply because I had a sense of what the meaning ought to be. But now we're able to confirm things by reference to the manuscripts. I'm going to talk about manuscripts in a few moments, inshallah. So وهدانا إلى أن قلنا, this is a very small difference with the مطبوع, إلى قولنا أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم من كل المعاصي والمنكرات. So you saw here what enabled us to perform the best of obedient deeds and shown us the means. So really I did translate according to وأوقفنا, even if the text said وفقنا, because it didn't seem to be quite sensible. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نشرع في أداء كل الخيرات والمأمورات الحمد لله الذي له ما في السماوات رب العالمين بحسب كل الذوات والصفات الرحمن الرحيم على أصحاب الحاجات وأرباب الضرورات مالك يوم الدين في إيصال الأبرار إلى الدرجات وإدخال الفجار في الدركات إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين في القيام بأداء جملة التكليفات اهدنا الصراط المستقيم بحسب كل أنواع الهدايات صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم في كل الحالات والمقالات. In the printed edition والمقامات, which is okay, but the copies have والمقالات. So the translation would change here according to that. In every condition, and station is what I've written, but in every condition and statement. غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين من أهل الجهالات والضلالات والصلاة على محمد المؤيد بأفضل المعجزات والآيات وعلى آله وصحبه بحسب تعاقب الآنات. So here the printed editions have al-ayat. So I said as long as the signs unfold, I would change that now. He clearly intended some kind of plural of an or moments as the moments unfold. وَسَلَّمَ تَسْلِيمًا or وَسَلِّمْ تَسْلِيمًا is in some of the copies and and not others, which is why it's indicated here with a square bracket. أما بعد فهذا كتاب مشتمل على شرح بعض ما رزقنا الله من علوم سورة الفاتحة ونسأل الله العظيم أن يوفقنا لإتمامه وأن يجعلنا في الدارين أهلا لإكرامه وإنعامه إنه خير موفق ومعين وبإسعاف الطالبين قمين. So far this part is okay. I mentioned here, of course, in the footnotes, as you tend to do, any variations that are significant. This one not so significant, but just to show that there are some other ways that it's worded. وهذا الكتاب مرتب على مقدمة وكتب أما المقدمة ففيها فصول. So in this introduction we have 3 فصول. الفصل الأول في التنبيه على علوم هذه السورة على سبيل الإجمال. In the footnote in English, likewise in Arabic, I have just indicated what he intends by saying علوم هذه السورة. اعلم أنه مر على لساني في بعض الأوقات أن هذه السورة الكريمة يمكن أن يستنبط من فوائدها ونفائسها 10,000 مسألة. فاستبعد هذا بعض الحساد وقوم من أهل الجهل والغي والعناد, some copy say والبغي, وحملوا ذلك على ما ألفوه من أنفسهم من التصلفات الفارغة عن المعاني والكلمات الخالية عن تحقيق المعاقد والمباني. فلما شرعت في تصنيف هذا الكتاب قدمت هذه المقدمة لتصير كالتنبيه على أن ما ذكرناه أمر ممكن الحصول قريب الوصول فنقول بالله التوفيق. And then he goes on to mention from the isti'adha onwards what is the way of extracting all these many masail or inquiries, points of investigation from the words of the surah, which then turn out to be much more than 10,000 as what he said at this point. So this is a very significant paragraph for the rest of the introduction. This was considered fanciful by certain people harboring envy, ignorance, delusion, obstinacy, who interpret it in light of their own practice, على ما ألفوه من أنفسهم, of making meaningless pronouncements. So this is how I interpreted what was in the printed text of التعلقات الفارغة. And I didn't sort of over translate this whole section here and make too much of what ultimately are kind of rhyming elaborations on making the same point, that it's all meaningless, right? But when I came to find the word tasallufat in the manuscripts, I realized that is what the word is supposed to be, not ta'alluqat, not tasnifat, and various things that are found in various copies. So this is significant because there are people who have written about this. For one thing, there is a French translation of the Fatiha in which he misunderstood ma alifuhu min anfusihim as if it was allafuhu min anfusihim, because he's written here, as you can see, qu'ils ont écrit eux-mêmes, right, what they have written, but there's nothing about writing here, so he must have read this as allafuhu. So the fact that I've put this kasra here is just to help that reader and help any reader not to make that mistake. So this is part of good book publishing, is to mark things that require some disambiguation. So then at-tasallufat, however, it is Tariq Jafar, the author of Oxford University Press book about Tafsir Razi, who has really made the most terrible mistake based on this. He has assumed that al-Razi here, instead of having an argument with some people on his travels, is talking about the previous Mufassirin, or that he's saying that what they assumed that he was saying is that I can just say the same empty pronouncements of the previous Mufassirin, right? Which is absolutely not what Imam al-Razi is saying, and he doesn't have that attitude towards previous tafsirs. If he does, then you need to find something else to establish that, because this paragraph certainly does not say that. So he builds a very strange argument upon it, and all from having misread the passage. He also read Ashratu Alaf as if it means 1,000, but that's a minor matter compared to this point. The words whose kernels and foundations were empty of verification, he takes to be an accusation against the early Mufassirin. So what would have definitely helped, if the word tasallufat were actually printed correctly, I think he would have found it much harder to make this misreading. Wallahu a'lam. So let me go from here into some description about manuscripts. Now, keep in mind that, let's bring this back up, that when it comes to manuscripts, there are many out there, in fact, and just for the Fatiha alone, I have about 80 written copies, varying in age from about a century after Razi or less, up until the late Ottoman period. And having gone through those, we established, myself and my student Muhammad Abdul Munim, we established a few words from the first page which were sort of key to checking whether it was a quality copy or not. So if it has maqalat and anat, and if it has awqafana, if it has tasallufat, it's one of the key ones. And another one just down below here about an-nubuwat is another of the sort of key words which we wanted to check whether it would get them right. So when we went through this 80, we found that, let's try to go back to a better size. We found that, some of them were getting this right or that right. We made this comparative table. And from that, it came that there were a few copies that were consistently right. So these ones that were consistently right, there was only a few of them, or those that were right almost all of the time according to the criteria that we set, we considered them to be higher quality copies. So then of those higher quality copies, those are the ones that we put right in front of us as we were doing this editing work. Other ones we can go to if we want to investigate a particular word more closely, including these ones that we actually did investigate across the 80 copies. So let me point out a couple of these copies for you, right? So one of them here is an early copy. So it's dated as 694, and I think we can trust this dating, which is at the end of the manuscript. I mean, I could show you how it's written here at the end. Here we are. The date is given here as 694 of the Hijrah, and it does appear to be one unified copy, except that on the first page you can see there's been some damage and some repair to this piece of text. There's also some holes. This particular hole at the bottom of the page took away a word which was very crucial to me. على أنه لا قسم إلا هذه الأقسام, or la jisma according to most of the copies, but here it was literally a hole, which was very funny and frustrating. So this is an example of an early copy, although there are a few that are even earlier, but typically we don't have complete copies from the 1st century. So, I mean, the 1st century after the death of al-Razi in 606 of the Hijrah. So another copy which was quite pivotal is this one, which is actually from 990 of the Hijrah. So it is a few centuries, let's say it is 4 centuries after al-Razi wrote this book. And it's, as you can see, a very sort of fine, ornate, ornamented copy. But most of it doesn't look like this first page. Most of it looks like this. So it is, it's actually not too difficult to read once you zoom in. But crucially, we found that this copy was retaining certain phrases and sentences that had gone missing from other copies. So it's proven to be one of the most reliable that is available. So there was about 3 or 4 others that we used quite consistently. So we'll continue from here about the isti'adha. إن قولنا أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم لا شك أن المراد منه الاستعاذة بالله عن جميع المنهيات والمحظورات. Now the printed copies have min, which might actually be better in a way, but it seems that the author himself has written an, or certainly the copies are telling us that. With further investigation, we might find that some of them say min, but I didn't find it in the copies that I looked at. أما الاعتقادات, right? So he talks about 2 types of forbidden things or sinful things. It can be in the field of إما أن تكون من باب الاعتقادات أو من باب أعمال الجوارح. So then أما الاعتقادات, I've marked this with this kind of different font as a way of using some means that's available to us in Arabic printing for headings and setting things off. We might in English here use small caps like I've done here in regard to beliefs. So the kind of equivalent that I've followed here is to use this other font. This is just a draft. It's not published yet, but this is an attempt to get the clarity into the Arabic text that I had previously achieved, alhamdulillah, in the translation. And the same applies to breaking it up into paragraphs. The same applies to lists, numbered lists. You're going to see how I try to improve the situation in the Arabic text compared to how it is. Because this is one of the big challenges with Tafsir Razi, is that, He'll sometimes elaborate on things at great length. He'll break things up into different sections. He'll break discussions up into different angles and stations. He'll give you lists and then lists within those lists and lists under those lists within the lists, right? So you have to, first of all, be able to read al-Razi accurately, and that itself is very challenging. After doing that, translating it follows. But the printed editions of al-Razi need to do much, much better than they currently do in getting this right, because frankly, they are sending people astray when they're trying to read Tafsir Razi. So أما الاعتقادات فقد جاء في الخبر المشهور قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم ستفترق أمتي على 73 فرقة كلهم في النار إلا ملة واحدة. So most of the copies are giving this word millah. So I made some comment about the hadith itself and the wording of the hadith. I didn't do here a full takhrij as you would get in a proper published edition. I forgot to mention, or maybe this is just the moment to mention, that there is an edition which is being prepared now by Darul Lubab in Turkey. And I'm in touch with the publisher, and I'm in discussion with them about how they can do the best job of it. And I'm very hopeful and optimistic that they will do a great job, because they have got on board well-respected specialists in the field. But I'm also trying to see if there's something by way of suggestions and improvement and participation that I can offer and that Ibn Ashur Center can offer to that project. But in any case, if nothing else, then I've done this part in order to try to indicate a standard which I hope that they will not only match, but they will exceed, because it is an experienced publishing house in the field of tafsir, among other things. And they have previously released an edition of the Kashaf and of Suyuti's Hashia on al-Baydawi and numerous other things. So, وهذا يدل على أن الاثنين والسبعين موصوفون بالعقائد الفاسدة والمذاهب الباطلة، ثم إن ضلال كل واحد من هؤلاء الفرق غير مختص بمسألة واحدة. So these are small differences with the matbu'. I noticed that in the manuscripts go al-ithnain wa huwa al-ithnani wa sab'un. One would expect the feminine here, and the matbu' does have the feminine, but I can't put it here in the text until I've found it in a manuscript. So with further investigation, that might come to light. Or maybe it is al-ithnan, and that could be acceptable as well. So بل هو حاصل في مسائل كثيرة من المباحث المتعلقة بذات الله تعالى وبصفاته وبأحكامه وبأفعاله وبأسمائه وبمسائل الجبر والقدر والتعديل والتجوير. All of the copies have got, the printed edition and many of the manuscripts have got والتجويز. But if you look into it, you would find, of course, the issue, this discussion in theology is تعديل والتجوير, right? So this was already corrected in the translation, as you can see. والنبوات والمعاد. Now many copies have والثواب والمعاد, and I translated accordingly, in reward, resurrection, promises and threats. It could be الثواب, but structurally, given that he's talked here about ilahiyat, and then I think he's talking about nubuwat and ma'ad as two of the three major branches of ilm al-kalam, which is ilahiyat, nubuwat, al-ma'ad. So I've indicated in the footnote that I think the copies that say nubuwat are in fact the ones that are right, and that again became one of the ways in which I ascertained what is a reliable copy. Thawab is a possibility, so I've mentioned here that it is mentioned in some nusakh. والوعد والوعيد والأسماء والأحكام والإمامة. فإذا, and bearing in mind he says asma and ahkam before this, I don't know why that has happened, but it does. That's how it is in the copies. فإذا وزعنا عدد الفرق الضالة وهو 72 على هذه المسائل الكثيرة بلغ العدد الحاصل مبلغا عظيما، وكل ذلك أنواع الضلالات الحاصلة في فرق الأمة، وأيضا that's within the Muslim Ummah. فمن المشهور أن فرق الضلال من الخارجين, the printed edition has ضلالة, I think, small difference, not a big deal, but we're marking anything here in yellow that differs from the printed edition. من الخارجين عن هذه الأمة يقربون من 700، فإذا ضمت أنواع الضلالات ضلالاتهم إلى أنواع الضلالات الموجودة في فرق الأمة في جميع المسائل العقلية المتعلقة بالإلهيات والمتعلقة بأحكام الذوات والصفات بلغ المجموع مبلغا عظيما في العدد. This is nowadays, I don't know how far back it goes in the history of Arabic printing or writing, but this is sometimes used to mark the khabar after a long sentence to make it easier for the reader to find what is going on in the sentence. ولا شك أن قولنا أعوذ بالله يتناول الاستعاذة من جميع. So he says min here, as we would expect, جميع تلك الأنواع والاستعاذة عن الشيء, that's how it is, لا يمكن إلا بعد معرفة المستعاذ منه وإلا بعد معرفة كون ذلك الشيء باطلا وقبيحا. فظهر بهذا الطريق أن قولنا أعوذ بالله مشتمل على الألوف من المسائل الحقيقية اليقينية. I could read more slowly and make less mistakes, but and then you can speed it up on YouTube, I suppose. But I'll just read fast and you just excuse me for some slip-ups sometimes. وأما الأعمال الباطلة فهي عبارة عن كل ما ورد النهي عنه. So here, as for wrong actions, just as I've used small caps here, I've used this alternative font here. عن كل ما ورد النهي عنه إما في القرآن أو في الأخبار المتواترة أو في أخبار الآحاد أو في إجماع الأمة أو في القياسات الصحيحة. ولا شك أن تلك المنهيات تزيد على الألوف. ولا شك أن وقولنا أعوذ بالله متناول لجميعها وجملتها. فثبت بهذا الطريق أن قولنا أعوذ بالله مشتمل على 10,000 مسألة أو أزيد أو أقل من المسائل المهمة المعتبرة. So then he moves on to the basmala. وأما قوله جل جلاله بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ففيه نوعان من البحث. النوع الأول أنه, this is a small difference, just some of the other copies just have قد اشتهر عند العلماء أن لله سبحانه وتعالى 1001 من الأسماء المقدسة المطهرة وهي موجودة في الكتب والسنة في الكتاب والسنة. ولا شك أن البحث عن كل واحد من تلك الأسماء مسألة شريفة عالية. وأيضا فالعلم بالاسم لا يحصل إلا إذا كان مسبوقا بالعلم بالمسمى. والبحث فالبحث عن ثبوت تلك المسميات وعن الدلائل الدالة على ثبوتها وعن أجوبة الشبهات التي تذكر في نفيها مسائل كثيرة ومجموعها يزيد على الألوف. So then he goes on to talk about the باء. أن الباء في قوله بسم الله باء الإلصاق, the باء of attachment. And one of the things that I did back in the translation is to give some cross-references to where he talks about this later in the volume or elsewhere. And so that's a khidmah that I've transferred here into the Arabic as well. وهي متعلقة بفعل فالتقدير, that's how I find it in the copies. But there's some of them have والتقدير. I chose فا as making best sense. بسم الله أشرع في أداء الطاعات. وهذا المعنى لا يصير ملخصا معلوما إلا بعد الوقوف على أقسام الطاعات. Now this particular phrase, true beliefs and pure actions, was quite interesting to look at in the copies because a lot of them had al-aqaid al-khafiyya and then al-amal al-sa'iba or al-sayiba as it's typically written. And from these, it seemed right that he's saying al-haqqa, not al-khafiyya, which is hidden. And it seemed more appropriate that he's saying al-sa'iba than al-safiya. I can't remember that I've seen al-safiya. Yes, I have seen it in some copies. But the printed editions at the moment have al-haqqa was-safiya, which is not bad. But I think al-haqqa was-sa'iba is the best choice from these options. So true beliefs and pure actions are realized with reference to their proofs and contentions that are responded to. So this whole section, فقوله بسم الله يصير معلوما إلا بعد الوقوف على جميع العقائد الحق وجميع الأعمال الصائبة. This part here is corrupted in the printed editions. Basically, it has sort of slipped into this paragraph where it doesn't belong. Or rather, what's happened is I think this part is missing and this part was mixed in here, right? So by looking at the manuscripts, I've now ascertained how it should be and it makes sense now. وَمِنَ اللَّطَائِفِ أَنَّ قَوْلَهُ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ إشارة إلى نفي ما لا ينبغي من الاعتقاد والعمليات. وقوله بسم الله إشارة إلى إثبات ما ينبغي. So that word is not in the printed editions. These are slightly alternative words that are given. إثبات ما ينبغي من الاعتقادات والعمليات. وهذا هو الترتيب الذي يشهد بصحة العقل الصحيح والحق الصريح. So what happened in the printed editions was that this phrase here was kind of inserted wrongly into this paragraph. And my translation follows that wrong text. So in a next edition, inshallah, I will fix it and put it back to where it's supposed to be. So now, the second ayah, according to al-Razi's opinion that he takes, which is that Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is the first ayah. So he says, أما قوله جل جلاله الحمد لله فاعلم أن الحمد إنما يكون حمدا على النعمة والحمد على النعمة لا يمكن إلا بعد معرفة تلك النعمة لكن أقسام النعم الله خارجة عن التحديد والإحصاء كما قال تعالى وإن تعودوا نعمة الله لا تحصوها. ولنتكلم في مثال واحد وهو أن العاقل يجب أن يعتبر ذاته. So there were some copies that had وصفاته and it doesn't seem that it's necessary at all, but I've put it here in square brackets to indicate that, you know, that might have been part of the original text, but a lot of the copies don't have it. وذلك أنه مؤلف من نفس وبدن ولا شك أن أدون الجزئين وأقلهما فضيلة ومنفعة or منقبة according to one copy at least هو البدن. ثم أن أصحاب التشريح وجدوا قريبا من 5000 نوع من المنافع والمصالح التي دبرها الله عز وجل بحكمته في تخليق بدن الإنسان. ثم إن من وقف على هذه الأقسام المذكورة في كتب التشريح عرف أن نسبة هذا القدر المعلوم المذكور إلى ما لا يعلم ولم يذكر كالقطرة في البحر المحيط. So there are small differences here in between this and the printed copies. أن معرفة وأن هذا يظهر أن معرفة أقسام حكمة الرحمن في خلق الإنسان تشتمل على 10,000 مسألة أو أكثر. ثم إذا ضم I think it's just ضمت in the printed copy إلى هذه الجملة آثار حكمة الله تعالى في تخليق العرش والكرسي وأطباق السماوات وأجرام النيرات من الثوابت والسيارات وتخصيص كل واحد منها بقدر مخصوص ولون مخصوص. Now this is a huge mistake in the printed copies. And that's why I marked this in red. So ولون مخصوص وغير مخصوص is what it says in the printed copies. Now when I translated it, it didn't seem quite right and I kind of fluffed around that to avoid saying غير مخصوص. Where is it? Perfect wisdom. Constituent beings in the name with all their types and situations. Did it have colors? أطباق السماوات. Its proportion and hue. Each accorded its proportion and hue. So I just basically didn't translate غير مخصوص because it didn't seem to fit in or really add anything. But now I realize وحيز مخصوص, that is to say, or its position as well. Each accorded its position, proportion, hue, and position, something like this. ثم يضم إليها آثار حكمة الله تعالى في تخليق الأمهات والمولدات من الجمادات والنبات والحيوانات واختلاف أقسامها وأحوالها. There's not much difference here. علم أن هذا المجموع مشتمل على 1000 مسألة أو أكثر أو أقل. ثم إنه تعالى نبه على أن أكثرها مخلوق لمنفعة الإنسان كما قال وسخر لكم ما في السماوات وما في الأرض. وحينئذ يظهر أن قوله الحمد لله مشتمل على 100,000 مسألة أو أكثر أو أقل. So none of the printed copies have 100,000, they just have على 1000 مسألة. So that's why I've translated it as 1,000,000 inquiries. But just the previous part had also 1,000,000 inquiries. It could be that he's just repeating himself or that, you know, 1,000,000 or more. But rather from the makhtutat, from the manuscripts, it appears that what he's saying is once you incorporate this as well, it multiplies by an order of 1,000. عفوا by 100 على 100,000 مسألة. So that's nice, isn't it? Now our new edition inshallah will say 100 million inquiries instead of a million inquiries. وأما قوله جل جلاله رب العالمين or رب العالمين as you say فاعلم أن قوله رب مضاف وقوله العالمين مضاف إليه وإضافة الشيء إلى الشيء تمتنع معرفتها إلا بعد الحصول العلمي بالمضافين. The printed copies have متضافين which is okay as well. فمن المحال حصول العلم بكونه تعالى ربا للعالمين إلا بعد معرفة العالمين. I think there's also a difference here with the printed copies, but I would need to check that. ثم إن العالمين عبارة عن كل موجود سوى الله تعالى وهي على 3 أقسام: المتحيزات والمفارقات والصفات. أما المتحيزات فهي إما بسائط أو مركبات. This is very sort of philosophical talk here. You might find it hard to follow, or you might be having the best time of your life. I don't know. أما البسائط فهي الأفلاك والكواكب والأمهات. وأما المركبات فهي المواليد 3. واعلم أنه لم يقم الدليل لم يقم دليل على أنه لا قسم إلا هذه الأقسام وذلك لأنه ثبت بالدليل. So the printed copies have لم يقم دليل على أنه لا جسم إلا هذه الأقسام. لا جسم إلا هذه الأقسام. So actually most of the manuscripts that I looked at also have لا جسم. I found maybe, or Muhammad found for me, I think 8 of them which have لا قسمة, and I am convinced that لا قسمة is the correct reading. So look here. This is something that I noticed before having any manuscript. Alhamdulillah, I have a sense of when something is not right. Know that there's no proof of bodies, لا جسمة, being restricted to these 3 categories. In the footnote I said, or perhaps what is intended here are existence. لا موجودة إلا هذه الأقسام, for example. But then when it came to be لا قسمة, well, that just solved the issue for me. I should say also, a brother called Sheikh Amin Abdur Rauf wrote to me in an email about this, and he also had found in a manuscript that it should be La Qisma. I think he just saw it in one manuscript, but that, I should say, he's the first person who raised that with me, having looked at my translation and the fact that I problematized this. So it's, you know, it's really great that people are interested to this extent and keen to correct the text. So we need to get it done. We need to get this published. وذلك لأنه ثبت بالدليل okay أنه حصل خارج هذا العالم, or just خارج العالم is fine, but some copies have this. خلاء لا نهاية له وثبت بالدليل أنه تعالى قادر على جميع الممكنات وهو تعالى قادر على أن يخلق ألف عالم خارج العالم بحيث يكون كل واحد من تلك العوالم أعظم وأجسم من هذا العالم ويحصل في كل واحد منها مثل ما حصل في هذا العالم من العرش والكرسي والسماوات والأراضين والشمس والقمر. والدلائل الفلاسفة في إثبات أن العالم واحد دلائل ضعيفة ركيكة مبنية على مقدمة واهية. I'm just leaving the vowels off the end of words for speed. ولهذا السبب قال أبو العلاء المعري. Oh, this is a nice interesting part. Right. So I'm going to have to translate this or work on it a bit more. Oh, people, how many celestial spheres belong to God? I asked my friend Sheikh Shaheen al-Rahman to help me with the arud part of this because I don't generally recognize the urud and qawafi of poetry. I need to study that myself. But he told me that this, I think he said is basit, and it is the same as we have for the Qasidat al-Burda, right? So to check this, we can sing it according to the same way that the Burda is recited, right? So, Ya ayyuhan nasu kam lillahi min falakin tajri nujumu bihi wash-shamsu wal-qamaru. So far, so good. Because I asked him, should it be faya? Because some copies have faya ayyuhan nas, or some places where it is printed, it's written faya ayyuhan nas. So no, it should be ya ayyuhan nas. كنا على الله ماضينا وغابرون فما لنا في نواحي غيره خطر. So as he told me, مستفعل فاعل مستفعل فاعل. Right. So هن does fit. The matbu' has hayyin. Right. Hayyin. That would only fit if you put a sukoon on the noon which is, you know, not really a normal thing to do, but let's say at least maybe for ضرورة الشعر, it could be هين على الله ماضينا, maybe it works. But hunna is how it is in the manuscripts. As we saw at the beginning from the Bulaq edition, there was a note on the margin that said some of the copies say hunna فعل ماض. Now I spent a long time trying to figure out what is this فعل ماض because it didn't click with me that the na is, you know, is constructed for نحن. I was thinking it's مبني للمجهول or للمفعول, and the ماضينا غابرنا are the fa'il of it. So how can this, what kind of root would that have? So I consulted with my friend Sheikh Faisal Qasim. He went through a bunch of the possibilities, and when he did that, I saw one possibility that really stood out, and that is, it is the verb hana yahunu, to be trivial, to be easy, right? As we have in the ayah, it's Ar-Rum verse 27, وَهُوَ الَّذِي يَبْدَأُ الْخَلْقَ ثُمَّ يُعِيدُهُ وَهُوَ أَهْوَنُ عَلَيْهِ. He is the one who initiates the creation and then repeats it, and it is أَهْوَنُ عَلَيْهِ. On the Zahir, it would be, it is even easier for him the second time round, but as theologically that might create some questions, so it can be understood instead as, and it is extremely easy for him to do so. وَهُوَ أَهْوَنُ عَلَيْهِ. So hunna, we were easy for Allah, we were trivial for Allah to create. ماضينا وغابرنا, I suppose then is بدل اشتمال. So I'm now happy and convinced that the word here should be hunna and not hayyin as it is in the مطبوع. ومعلوم أن البحث, okay, then the translation would have to change. Trifling. So I don't think it's past and future. I think it's probably those who have gone before us and those who remain, right? And yeah, the rest of it might be still okay. ومعلوم أن البحث عن هذه الأقسام التي ذكرناها للمتحيزات يشتمل على ألوف من المسائل، بل الإنسان لو ترك الكل وأراد أن يحيط علمه بعجائب المعادن المتولدة في أرحام الجبال من الفلزات والأحجار الصافية وأنواع الكباريت والزرانيخ والأملاح. If you want to know what all these things are, I looked them up some time ago, so here's the translations. Compounds and salts, and knowing the various types of plant life. This one, well, Anwar, I found to be correct. Originally, I thought it should be An-Nuwar, but Al-Anwar is fine, but it just doesn't mean lights, as you might think. Al-Anwar is the jam' of Nawr, which is blossoms, as I translated it here. والثمار عجائب أقسام الحيوانات والبهائم والوحوش والطيور والحشرات. Right, then the خبر of that, لنفد عمره في أقل القليل من هذا المطالب. Okay, where is the beginning of the sentence? لو ترك, so it's not the خبر, it's the جواب of لو. ولا ينتهي إلى غورها كما قال تعالى ولو أن ما في الأرض من شجرة أقلام والبحر يمده من بعده 7 أبحر ما نفدت كلمات الله وهي بأسرها وأجمعها داخلة تحت قوله رب العالمين. Then verse 3. أما قوله تعالى الرحمن الرحيم فاعلم أن الرحمة عبارة عن التخليص من أنواع الآفات. So also bear in mind we've added commas and things like that. They exist in the printed edition and they're mostly fine, but sometimes these things, punctuation can go wrong and can mislead you. وعن إيصال الخيرات إلى أصحاب الحاجات. So I haven't marked how I've changed the punctuation. Those are just things which you have to pay attention to when you're finalizing the text. أما التخليص عن أقسام الآفات فلا يمكن معرفته إلا بعد معرفة أقسام الآفات وهي كثيرة لا يعلمها إلا الله تعالى ومن شاء أن يقف على قليل منها فليطالع كتب الطب حتى يقف عقله على أقسام الأسقام التي يمكن تولدها في كل واحد من الأعضاء والأجزاء ثم يتأمل في أنه تعالى. This part was completely messed up in the printed editions, where basically it was just missing. Still, the translation probably is fine. Then ponder how God has guided the intellects. It went straight from this. ثم يتأمل في أنه تعالى كيف هدى عقول الخلق. I think it's basically like that. But this whole phrase was missing, and it really does help make the meaning clearer, although you can just about manage without it. Just as Allah has sent illnesses, He also created a cure and medicine for every illness. And then you should ponder how Allah has guided human minds to realize what is nutritious and also healing for mankind. وقد حكي عن جالينوس. It said حكى جالينوس in the printed edition, which kind of works, but because it's in his book. But I think حكي عن is right, because that's how it is in the nusakh that I looked at. في تخليق العصبتين المجوفتين. What I did in the translation is I actually went and compared this with the English translation from the Greek of Perikraios Morion, the usefulness of the parts of the body, Manafi' al-A'da. So this was, me being geeky about it, but that's fine. I didn't pass that over here into the Arabic because, why do you want to read in Arabic an English translation of it? But maybe someone has done an Arabic translation of Manafi' al-A'da in full. If so, it would be nice to include a footnote here so you can compare the way al-Razi quotes Galen with how he has been found to have spoken directly in his book. So small differences here. I won't read through all of this at the moment. Al-Khansir wal-Binsir, small and ring fingers. Then he says, وَأَكْثَرُ عِلَاجَاتِ الطِّبِّ. Now most of the copies here have, as in the printed edition, alamat, أكثر علامات الطب. And when I translated it, I just went by what the meaning would seem to be. Most significant medical discoveries originate at some point as some forms of inspiration. But I think now that I've found the word ilajat in one of the copies at least, that seems to be the word that would be said here, because alamat doesn't fit very clearly in this sentence. تنتهي في أوائلها إلى أمثال هذه التنبيهات والإلهامات. إذا وقف الإنسان على أمثال المباحث عرف أن أقسام رحمة الله تعالى على عباده خارجة عن الضبط والإحصاء. Then الآية الرابعة مالك يوم الدين. فاعلم أن الإنسان كالمسافر في هذه الدنيا وسينوه كالفراسخ وشهوره كالأميال. Here ومقصده الوصول إلى عالم أخراه in the printed edition. So I just found it in the nusakh as al-akhirah, as you probably expect. And here فلينظر in the printed editions, فلينظر may in fact be correct. It looks like it should be فلينظر. But what I found in the nusakh was فانظر. So until I search further and find فلينظر, I can't really establish it here as the word. إذا عرفت هذا فنقول قوله مالك يوم الدين إشارة إلى مسائل المعاد والحشر والنشر وهي قسمان بعضها عقلية محضة وبعضها سمعية. So here again I've used this kind of font variation to help make it clearer, the structure, the عقلية and the سمعية. So I will just pass over this a little bit more quickly. السمعيات, this was an important part. In my translation, I used a numbered list here, but I felt that in the Arabic, there wasn't really a need for that. Certainly, I could have also done this with small caps or something. But the sam'iyat, this is an important error in the printed editions, and indeed in many of the nusakh. So, al-ahwal التي توجد, he mentions that there's ثلاثة أقسام. In the printed editions, it says عند قيام القيامة, and then again عند قيام القيامة, and then thirdly بعد قيام القيامة, right? So I naturally understood, as you can see in the translation here, that it's not عند, it should be قبل, but I said the printed editions have عند in both points. When you look at the manuscripts, you find actually that some of them have got this like a chunk missing. even the oldest copy, like two of the ones that are within 1 century of al-Razi's death, they also had these sections missing. But I found it in some other copies, and it was quite clear that this phrase is supposed to be here, and the word qabla is supposed to be there. So الأحوال التي توجد قبل قيام القيامة وهي العلامات الدالة على قيام القيامة وتلك العلامات منها صغيرة. So there's a bit here that needs to be added to the translation as well. ومنها كبيرة وهي العلامات العشر. The printed editions have عشرة, which is, I think, fine, but al-ashr is what's written. You can also notice that I have tried to create a system for numbered lists. This is just indicative. I can show the publisher, the idea, and then they can work on, how to make that work in a typesetting context. But here is just to show, like, to make it easier to see where he's providing a list, right? Because that is something that's always challenging when reading الرازي's tafsir. وثالثها الأحوال التي توجد بعد قيام القيامة وشرح أحوال أهل الموقف. And then وكيفية الأهوال التي يشاهدونها. Most copies have, at least the ones I looked at, from the few that I looked at specifically, have al-ahwal. Al-ahwal. And the translation, and what they experienced there. But since I saw in one copy al-ahwal, I think only in one at the moment, right? But again, we can look at more copies to ascertain this. I think al-ahwal is probably the word that should be here, because he could just be repeating the word ahwal over and over. But when you talk about the horrors of the Day of Judgment, the word uses al-ahwal. وكيفية حضور الملائكة والأنبياء عليهم السلام وكيفية الحساب وكيفية وزن الأعمال والذهاب فريق إلى الجنة وفريق إلى السعير. The copies have, the printed editions have إلى النار, which is equivalent, but فريق إلى السعير sounds like the way he'd have worded it, following the wording of the Quran. وكيفية صفة أهل الجنة وصفة أهل النار. من هذا الباب شرح أحوال أهل الجنة وأهل النار. I should say also all the manuscripts had as-sa'ir as well, the ones that I looked at. So I'm not just going by sense and meaning, I'm going by, what is in the manuscripts. ولعل مجموع هذه المسائل العقلية والنقلية يبلغ الألوف وهي بأسرها داخلة. Small difference here about some wording. Verse 5. أما قوله تعالى إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين فاعلم أن العبادة عبارة عن الإتيان بالفعل المأمور به على سبيل التعظيم للآمر. فلما لم يثبت بالدليل أن لهذا العالم إلها واحدا قادرا. I don't know if I read this correctly just now. فما لم يثبت. So until it is established, so as long as it remains unestablished that there is one God, etc., then there would be a certain problem here. فإنه لا يمكن القيام بلوازم قوله تعالى إياك نعبد. So again, this helped me just now to find what was the jawab of فما لم, right? So here in the translation, you can see, it is therefore not possible to fulfill the implications unless it is shown with proof. So I translated it in a way that makes that sentence easier to parse and understand. There was a copy, I think I said فَمَهْمَا لَمْ يَثْبُتْ, which is probably fine as well, but most of them just said فَمَا لَمْ يَثْبُتْ. ثم إن بعد الفراغ من المقام المذكور لابد من تفصيل أقسام تلك التكاليف وبيان أنواع تلك الأوامر والنواهي وجميع ما صنف في الدنيا. This was in the printed editions صنف في الدين, and that kind of works, but في الدنيا is clearly right. Everything written in the genre of positive law, that is fiqh. So I would now translate everything in the world or everything in the world written in the genre of positive law falls under the duties enjoined by God. So there was a quite big error in the printed edition here, because what they'd written is يدخل في تكاليف الله ثم, which is wrong. It should say جميع وجميع ما صنف في الدنيا من كتب الفقه يدخل فيه. End of sentence. So it should say everything written in the world in the genre of positive law falls under these commands and prohibitions or takalif. And then we don't need this enjoined by God. That is not in the text, right? Enjoined by God. This is not in the text. Then he makes another point. ثم كما يدخل فيه تكاليف الله تعالى بحسب هذه الشريعة فكذلك يدخل فيه تكاليف الله تعالى بحسب الشرائع التي قد كان أنزلها الله تعالى على الأنبياء المتقدمين وأيضا يدخل فيه الشرائع التي كلف الله بها الملائكة في السماوات منذ خلق الملائكة وأمرهم بالاشتغال وخلق الملائكة وأمرهم. You could read it that way as well. وأيضا فكتب الفقه مشتملة على شرح التكاليف المتوجهة في أعمال الجوارح. Some of them said إنما تشتمل, which is to be honest quite nice. أما أقسام التكاليف الموجودة في أعمال القلوب فهي أكبر وأعظم وأجل. Some copies have أكثر, but probably أكبر matches better with أعظم وأجل. وهي التي تشتمل عليها كتب الأخلاق وكتب السياسات بحسب الملل المختلفة والأمم المتباينة. So I understood this as character and practical philosophy in different religions. Right, so let's move to the ayah السادسة. أما قوله جل جلاله اهدنا الصراط المستقيم فاعلم أنه عبارة عن طلب الهداية ولتحصيل الهداية طريقان. So we're going to have two طريقs. So I've marked these here with these different fonts, especially because this one is a little bit further down. So you need to have a sense of, okay, I've finished this previous heading and I'm now in this heading. Even though I didn't make it as a heading as such, I could have changed this bit of the font to be like that, all of it. But even just doing it here in sort of the early part of the sentence is enough to signal that this is the follow-up, the second branch after this branch. طرق الاستدلال فكأنها غير متناهية لأنه لا ذرة من ذرات العالم الأعلى والأسفل إلا وتلك الذرة شاهدة بكمال إلهيته ونعوت عزته. Right, this is a brilliant one. Bears testimony to his perfect divinity, might and supremacy. So the printed edition has وبعزة عزته وبعزة عزته, which maybe works, but it's a little bit strange. And at least one of the copies provided وَنُعُوتِ عِزَّتِهِ, and I think that's what has been misread. The noon could have been read as a ba, the waw could have been read as a zai, and maybe if this looked like a ta marbuta instead, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that the more sensible word here is وَنُعُوتِ عِزَّتِهِ, his the descriptions of his might. وبجلال صمديته كما قيل وفي كل شيء له آية تدل على أنه واحد. وتقريره أن أجسام العالم متساوية في ماهية الجسمية ومختلفة في الصفات وهي الألوان والأمكنة والأحوال. Okay, so I'm going to move through this a little bit faster. وذلك المخصص إن كان جسما عاد البحث فيه. There's got an alternative, or maybe an alternative word there in the printed edition, which is okay. But the word I found is البحث. بل كان التأثير بالفيض والطبع عاد الإلزام في وجوب الاستواء وإن كان حيا عالما قادرا فهو المطلوب. وإذا عرفت هذا فقد ظهر أن كل واحد من ذرات عالم السماوات والأراضين. This عالم is not in the printed edition. The printed editions have والأرض, and so do many copies. And that's fine. شاهد صادق ومخر ناطق بوجود الإله القادر الحكيم العليم. And then he quotes something from his father, which is very nice. The Shaykh and Imam Diya ad-Din Umar used to say, إن لله تعالى في كل جوهر فرد أنواعا غير متناهية من الدلائل الدالة على القدرة والحكمة والرحمة. Now, when translating it, I assume that this quote goes all the way to here, which would be here in the Arabic edition. Because فَثَبَتَ بِمَا ذَكَرْنَا really does sound like it's Imam Razi, the author, now writing that. But now, having looked at it again, I feel like probably the quote ends all the way here. And then Al-Razi starts describing here وَذَلِكَ لِأَنَّ كُلَّ جَوْهَرْ فَرْد, because فَثَبَتَ بِمَا ذَكَرْنَا has to refer back to some explanation that he's given. So I assume it's from here. So I've ended Diyauddin Umar's quote here. So this is one of the fundamental problems of a lot of Arabic texts, especially from the manuscripts and so on, is there isn't usually a very clear way of delineating end quotes. Start quotes, typically fine. End quotes, you can write alif ha for intaha, but that's not universally practiced, right? And it tends to be if it was a long quote, but even then you can find that goes missing, right? So I'm just going to make my best judgment that that's the end of the quote, and I'm going to put quote marks so that I make clear at least how I'm interpreting the start and end of the quote, so that can become clearer for people who read it. Now, when Al-Razi quotes people, sometimes he quotes even opposing madhahib. He'll quote the Mu'tazila, he'll quote the Jahmiya, whatever it may be. And he can make a quote that is paragraphs long, pages long even, right? So we need in the printed editions of Al-Razi to have that clearly delineated, because what happens a lot of the time is people pick up Tafsir Razi, they look at something, they open up a page and they read something, and then they assume that it was his point of view, rather than something that he's quoting for whatever reason, including to dispute it and disagree with it, right? So this is something which I hope we can use some new methods to make long quotes more clearly marked out, so that anyone who looks at it can see immediately that this is not part of his own text. In English publishing, English language publishing, we have very well established things of, indents and embedded things and italics, and in Arabic we can do similar things or use other ways, some kind of line that runs down the spine of a quote or something like that. Right. The other thing that happens here is ويمكن أيضا اتصافه بصفات غير متناهية على البدل. This word متناهية is missing from the printed editions, but obviously I picked up on the fact that it should say that. Maybe even I said some editions because I might have found even a printed edition that had the word متناهية. Maybe it was in the Bulaq edition and then dropped from subsequent ones, because sometimes that's the case. There are some new errors that crept into later editions. So if you were to ask the question, should you use the Bulaq edition then until we have a decent one? Maybe, but it's hard to read the Bulaq edition, right? Because it's one big block of text. At least later editions did some breaking up into paragraphs, and they, there's a little bit of work done which you can kind of make use of. There's very, very little treatment of hadiths or anything like that, which you would expect from any tahqiq. Even the Dar al-Hadith edition, which I showed you, I'll pull it up again. Right, so recently I found the Dar al-Hadith edition was scanned, and it mentions here, tahqiq by Sayyid Imran. Now, there is no tahqiq, as I said. He has not done tahqiq and should not claim. And by the way, I'm not entirely sure there is a person called Sayyid Imran. You can't Google this person's name and find some kind of scholar who is known as Sayyid Imran, Mr. Imran. I don't know. He might exist, he might not, but given the practices of certain publishing houses, it could just be a name that is stuck on because, some office boy or girl was just given the job of throwing this together. At some point he's called Abu Hafs Sayyid Imran, so he might be somebody who's got a daughter called Hafsa. I don't know what's going on here, or a son called Hafs, right? So there is occasionally some footnotes with hadiths. That's for Abu Ala al-Mari, okay, Jalinus, but just very selectively, and it's not consistent, and the ahkam on the hadith are not reliable. Lots of hadiths are simply missed out, like they're not given any takhrij. So this kind of stuff is probably copied and pasted from somewhere, and the introduction doesn't fill you with any confidence, to put it mildly. So I remember I have said in the introduction that one could doubt whether there is a Sayyid Imran. If someone knows him, let me know. Put me in touch with him. I'll ask him, how dare you? How dare you put your name as a muhaqqiq when you've done nothing of tahqiq? But I don't think they exist. But if you know him, if you know Mr. Imran, put him in touch with Dr. Sohaib, inshallah. Right. أما تحصيل الهداية بطريق الرياضة والتصفية فذاك بحر لا, they have فذلك, which is fine, but فذاك is how I found it. بحر لا ساحل له ولكل واحد من السائرين إلى الله تعالى منهج خاص ومشرب معين كما قال تعالى ولكل وجهة هو موليها ولا وقوف للعقول على تلك الأسرار ولا خبر عند الأفهام من مبادئ ميادين تلك الأنوار والعارفون المحققون لاحظوا سمسي لخصوا but لاحظوا does seem to be right فيها مباحث عميقة وأسرارا دقيقة قلما ترقى السمسي in the printed edition it has ترقى but also I found this تترقى so I've done إثبات of that both are fine إليها أفهام الأكثرين. And then the 7th ayah, the final ayah, very short comment that he makes about it. فما أجل هذه المقامات وأعظم مراتب هذه الدرجات. Okay, so then he says, you would, after looking at all of this, you would find that whoever said, namely al-Razi himself, that هذه السورة مشتملة على عشرة آلاف مسألة كلام خرج على ما يليق بأفهام السامعين. So he was just saying it 10,000 almost to make it easier for you to accept, but in fact it can be as much as 100 million just within one ayah. Then he moves on to الفصل الثاني في تقرير مشرع آخر يدل على أنه يمكن استنباط المسائل الكثيرة من الألفاظ القليلة. So a lot of the time when he's talking about أعوذ, he says قوله, sometimes he says قولنا. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم is not exactly, it's not an ayah, so it's a bit strange to say قوله. But بشيء من التجوز, it's fine. قوله أعوذ نوع من أنواع الفعل المضارع. Of course there's some ayahs that have أعوذ. Yeah, don't have to write in and tell me that. والفعل المضارع نوع من أنواع الفعل. وأما الباء في قوله بالله فهي باء الإلصاق وهي نوع من أنواع حروف الجر. وحروف الجر أحد أنواع الحرف. So small variations here with the matbu'. What he does here, he moves into increasing levels of abstraction in order to show how deeply you can delve into the realities of the expressions of the Quran, and beyond that to speech and existence altogether, right? So I won't go through all of that just now. You can certainly read it and read the translation, but I'll show you some issues that came up in the text. Okay. ويذكر فيه الوجوه الكثيرة, mentioning about whether the name Allah is derived from anything. There are opinions which are mentioned in book 2 of volume 1, chapter 9. So he says التي قيل بكل واحد منها. That's what the printed edition has, which is fine, but I found a nice version. قال بكل واحد منها طائفة. Right. وأيضا يجب البحث عن حقيقة الفعل المطلق. Right, so then he goes into الفعل, and then he says ثم نقول والمرتبة الرابعة. Now what happened here, as I indicated here in the translation, is that he says the 4th level without having described exactly what are the first 3 levels. So I've just understood that it is the nouns, the verbs, the particles respectively. So I've had to just say the similar in the Arabic. الاسم والفعل والحرف أنواع ثلاثة داخل تحت جنس الكلمة. So he talks about that and the questions that arise about the كلمة. والمرتبة الخامسة من البحث أن نقول لا شك أن هذه الكلمات إنما تحصل من الأصوات والحروف. So we have to look into صوت. And that goes into and the حرف as well. وأما الحرف إنما تتولد عند تقطيع الصوت في محابس مخصوصة. So in the printed edition في مخارج, which is also fine, and we do talk about that in Tajweed, makharij, but the copies I looked at had محابس. في بعض النسخ مخارج as well. Yeah. مخصوصة في الحلق واللسان والأسنان والشفتين etc. etc. والمرتبة السادسة من البحث هي أن الصوت والحرف the copies have them the other way around which is fine as well. كيفيات محسوسة بحاسة السمع وأما الألوان والأضواء فهي كيفيات محسوسة بحاسة البصر والطعوم etc. etc. وإنه لا مشاركة بينها إلا في اللوازم الخارجية. There were some variations here خارجية or خارجة. This وهي, some of the copies have, or actually many of them have أو هي. I must have found at least one copy that has وهي, and I think that in terms of meaning it should be وهي, but that needs some deeper thought as well. But the translation kind of indicates the way I understand the sentence when it says here, legends and sounds are perceived by the sense of hearing, whereas colors and lights perceived by sight. Is it therefore accurate to say that these perceptions fall under a single genus with distinct quiddities, and that they're only commonality? Right. So in terms of meaning, I think that وهي fits better. ثم نقول والمرتبة السابعة من أنواع جنس الكيف في المشهور. Okay, so they talks about that مرتبة, and then الثامنة أن مقولة الكيف ومقولة الكم ومقولة النسبة تشترك في الدخول تحت العرض. So here it just, most of them just said مقولة النسبة عرض, and one of them said أعراض. So this sort of more fleshed out phrase fits well. It follows the same format used here, and it is found in at least one of the copies. فيجب البحث عن حقيقة العرض وأقسامه وعن أحكامه ولوازمه وتوابعه. Now let me remember, what was this حقيقة? In the translation, let's see. Which leads to investigating the accident and its categories, rulings, concomitants, and implications. Let me just remember what was in the printed edition, because I've marked this as red, which means it's important, right? So this is just before المرتبة التاسعة. Okay. So they say عن مقولة العرض. عن مقولة العرض. So I think that حقيقة is right, and it is what also was in the copies. ثم نقول والمرتبة التاسعة أن العرض والجوهر يشتركان في الدخول تحت الممكن. And then here وفي كيفية وقوع لفظ الموجود على الواجب والممكن أنه هل هو قول الجنس على أنواعه أو قول اللوازم. Small differences with the مطبوع. والمرتبة العاشرة, then a little bit of a complicated argument that he makes here. And here it should indeed be فحينئذ يكون المقابل للمعلوم هو المعلوم وذلك محال. Whereas in the printed editions it just says معلوما, as it does here. So small differences, but a little bit of significance. And you can see a fair amount of voweling here, because I felt that you need, some of the readers would need a bit of help to process this. واعلم أن من اعتبر هذه المراتب العشرة في كل جزء من جزئيات الموجودات فقد انفتحت عليه أبواب مباحثة لا نهاية لها ولا يحيط عقله بأقل القليل منها. That's this part here. فظهر بهذا in some copies بهذا التنبيه كيفية استنباط العلوم الكثيرة من الألفاظ القليلة. So then, just coming to the end, another approach to demonstrate our claim في تقرير مشرع آخر لتصحيح ما ذكرناه من استنباط المسائل الكثيرة من هذه الصورة. So he tells us that every little thing he mentions should be considered a مسألة. اعلم أن إذا ذكرنا مسألة واحدة في هذا الكتاب ودللنا على صحتها بوجوه 10 فكل واحد من تلك الوجوه والدلائل مسألة بنفسها. ثم إذا حكينا فيها مثلا شبهات 5 فكل واحدة منها أيضا مسألة بنفسها. This small variations. In the printed edition I have مسألة مستقلة, I think, or مسألة مستقلة بنفسها. But I found that that's not what's going on in the nusakh. I think probably at some point someone's misread the word mas'ala as mustaqilla. As you can see, that can happen. ثم إذا أجبنا عن كل واحدة منها بجوابين أو ثلاثة فتلك الأجوبة الثلاثة أيضا المسائل الثلاثة. وإذا قلنا مثلا, this one I'm unsure about. In the printed edition we have الألفاظ الواردة في كلام العرب. Such and such words have come in the Arabic language in 60 forms. That's the way I translated it. So al-fadh I took as such and such words because it doesn't seem meaningful to say there are 60 forms of words, 60 types of al-fadh. I don't know if he means al-fadh, al-alfadh. Some of the copies have al-alqab, al-warida fi kalam al-arab, but then even then I don't know what does that refer to. And most of the ones that I looked at had al-alifat al-warida. So we could look at more copies, try to figure out what's going on. I'm not sure how there are 60 types of alif in the Arabic language, so that may not be correct. So the best that I can do is to do ithbat of what seems to be in the most reliable copies, and then indicate some variations which I came across, which indeed could be what was intended. وفصلنا تلك الوجوه فهذا الكلام في الحقيقة 60 مسألة. وذلك لأن المسألة, I just pointed out that when you see inquiry 1, inquiry 2 in the book, it doesn't follow this thing that he's saying here really. وإذا وقفت على هذه الدقيقة فنقول إنا لو اعتبرنا المباحث المتعلقة بالعلوم المذكور. So I think this needs, I should have marked this in yellow also because there was a major issue with the printed edition. So basically, the printed edition had this extra section, which extra chunk of words. When I delete something, I can't mark it in yellow. That's the problem. So the printed edition has got some extra words here which mess up the meaning. It says in the printed edition, إنا لو اعتبرنا المباحث المتعلقة, and then it says here, after here, بالاسم والفعل ثم ننزل منها إلى المباحث المتعلقة بتقسيم الأفعال, and then it goes on, بالمعلوم والمذكور. All of that kalam is not in the manuscript and doesn't make any sense and messes up the whole structure of this sentence and paragraph. So my translation also was affected by that. Then I say if we should consider the inquiries surrounding this, if اعتبرنا and then nanzil is 2 different tenses, so that should have been a sign that this was weird. In our actions into known and mentioned. So really it should be, if we should consider the inquiries surrounding the known and the mentioned and all of these things, this would be way too much to do. That's why he says here, the jawab of لو عظم الخطب واتسع الباب. So instead of that, ولكننا نبدأ في هذا الكتاب بالمباحث المتعلقة بالكلمة والكلام والقول واللفظ والعبارة ثم ننزل منها إلى المباحث المتعلقة بالاسم والفعل والحرف ثم ننزل منها إلى المباحث المتعلقة بتقسيمات الأسماء والأفعال والحروف حتى ننتهي إلى الأنواع الثلاثة الموجودة في قولنا أعوذ بالله ونرجو من فضل الله العميم أن يوفقنا للوصول إلى هذا المطلوب الكريم. So with that we make the same dua that Allah gives us tawfiq to complete this work, or rather that it be completed upon the hands of those who are most fit to carry it out, and that we, the reading public, have between our hands before too long a reliable copy of Tafsir al-Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, because it is more than deserving of receiving this khidmah, and we appeal to God's all-encompassing grace to grant us success in reaching this goal. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.